So welcome everybody, and to everybody who is watching the recording after the live event. I'd like to reintroduce Julie Anderson, who introduced us to her trilogy, the first book, Plague, during COVID in 21. That was, so we jumped at the title. And since then, she's written two more books and finished the trilogy, all set around Westminster. So I'll hand over to Julie now.
Right, well, thank you. I'm just going to share the screen so that I can put up my slides. Here we are. And I'm at the side there, you can see me. Participants can now see your application. There we go. Right. Now, I came along to talk to you before, as Jules said. First of all, I have to say thank you for inviting me back. You must have sort of enjoyed the first one, otherwise you wouldn't be doing that. To recap, for those of you who don't remember, I write contemporary crime novels set in and around and indeed under Westminster. Though I originally began writing historical novels some while ago, I was for many years a senior civil servant, and when I started to write crime, I set it in a world that I knew well, which was Whitehall and Westminster. And Plague, if any of you have read it, will know that it's very much a novel of London. It couldn't take place anywhere else, and neither can the third one, Opera. And it's this last one that my talk focuses on today. I will try and not give away any of the twists and turns of either this or indeed Plague, if people haven't read it. But suffice to say that Plague is the title, indeed all the titles are metaphors. And in Plague, as you will see from the tagline, power is a deadly contagion. It is power which is the contagion, not the pandemic, and it's not a COVID book. I have to say that an awful lot. The theme of the second book, Oracle, and the tagline there is Blood Calls for Blood, is justice in its different forms and how it can be corrupted. And then the third, Opera, is about truth or its opposite, lies, verisimilitude and deception. And it too is set in Westminster. Now there's a very bad screenshot of me talking to you back in March 2021 about Plague and the area in part in which it's set, which is that part of Thorney Island. And Opera is also set in that area in the city of Westminster, although with forays to SW4 Clapham, which is where my heroine lives, and coincidentally where I happen to live. But there are also, it's not only around the Palace of Westminster. We also have visits to Pimlico and also to Covent Garden. Much of it is set in Whitehall and the Palace of Westminster. And I did check with Jules before I started this talk. Thorney Island, of course, covers that part of Pimlico, as well as the very small island created by the delta of the River Tyburn, which is now the Palace of Westminster and immediate areas around there. I did want to check that. Now, as you might expect, a book called Opera includes a foray to the Royal Opera House, and a performance features there when my heroine Cassandra accompanies a party of visiting dignitaries to a gala performance of Tosca there. And there are various shenanigans that happen after the performance. But Tosca as an opera is actually very relevant to the theme of the book, in that that was set in 1800, when democracy and the forces of oppression, epitomised by the secret police chief Baron Scarpia and the Austrian Empire, were at loggerheads. It is in the book, my contention that, I mean, we're not in that dissimilar a situation today, but with Russia taking the Austrian Empire role. But it's watching Tosca that prompts my heroine to work out what may have happened in a recent and deadly crime, which she is investigating. But most of opera takes place in SW1, Westminster in central London, the power postcode, if you like, covering all the centres of power: spiritual, legislative, administrative, and legal, including the police and the security services, if you consider that wider definition of Thorney Island. And it's the murky world of espionage that my heroine has to negotiate if she is to solve the case. What is surprising is how close to each other these offices are. As my heroine says, as she's travelling into work on the number 88 bus, MI6 was back across the bridge, MI5 was up ahead on Millbank, and GCHQ London offices were in Victoria. It was a small world, the world of the intelligence services, even if its reach was global. And they are in very close proximity. You can walk between them without too much problem. And the first of them, and one that would have appeared on that map, is Thames House. This is Sir Frank Baines's neoclassical building with sculptures by Charles Sargent Jagger, and the sculptures are here on either side of the arch of St George and Britannia, and it stands on Millbank overlooking Lambeth Bridge. It was built by Imperial Chemicals, ICI, back in after the flooding, the disastrous flooding in 1928. The land was cleared, and they built both the Thames House here and also Chemicals House, which is the other one on the other side of Horseferry Road. And they're not identical, but they're very similar. MI5, Britain's internal, or if you like, Homeland Security Service, moved into Thames House in 1994, but it had occupied the top floor between 1934 and 39, but moved out because of the declaration of war and the coming Blitz. It eventually moved to Curzon Street, which is stayed in until 1994. And some of you may have frequented, as I used to, a restaurant called Mirabelle, which was opposite the old MI5 headquarters in Curzon Street, without ever knowing that that's where MI5 were. It's quite interesting in that this building, like the other buildings occupied by the security services, falls under the Serious Organised Crime and Police Act, in that it is specified that trespassing on in this building is a criminal offence. That unlike most public buildings, this is specified as somewhere you cannot go into without permission. I went into it quite a lot without permission, but that was when it held the Northern Ireland office, and I used to have to go there to talk to my fellow civil servants. A rather more modern one is the SIS or MI6 building at Vauxhall Cross, which we've all seen. 85 Albert Embankment, Britain's foreign intelligence, home of Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service. Now, when MI5 were looking for a new home back in 1994, so were MI6. It had formerly been housed in Century House, which was near Waterloo Station, and it was called, or that place was called, London's worst kept secret. And as the Telegraph said at the time, known to every taxi driver, tourist guide, and KGB agent. MI6 moved into this current site in 1994. It was formerly the site of Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, themselves located on what was New Spring Gardens before that, and mentioned by Pepys in 1662. This ziggurat type building is by Terry Farrell. It's been called Ceausescu Towers, Babylon on Thames, and my personal favourite, the Vauxhall Trollop, because of the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens and the dubious reputation that those gardens had, or certain parts of those gardens had. And I think it's one of only 2 moated buildings on the Thames, the other, of course, being the Tower of London. If you know of any more, please let me know. I used to work in the government building, Riverwalk House, which was directly opposite this building on the other side of Vauxhall Bridge. And you may recall that in 2000, there was a rocket attack on this building here with a rocket fired from what was the new Vauxhall Spring Gardens behind that building. And in fact, I mean, it didn't actually do any damage, the rocket, but there was much speculation in my offices about what happened if it overshoots, because if it did and went across the river, it would actually have hit the office building in which I was working and everyone else. I was also there in 2005 when there was a mass evacuation after a suspect parcel was found in Vauxhall Station. Which I have to say was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, because you had hundreds and hundreds of people all fleeing for what they thought was their lives, and it was very frightening indeed. The third security building that features in the novel is this, Nova South at Victoria, and this is occupied in part by GCHQ. It's less well known than the other 2. Because here is where the National Cyber Security Centre, which is part of GCHQ, is based. You can see there just the top of the Victoria Palace Theatre. The NCSC took up residence here in 2017, and it's where the Chief Executive has his office. My heroine, who is a former GCHQ employee, visits Nova South twice during the novel, each time to interview senior executives who are also suspects in the crime. Now, of course, GCHQ is normally associated with the donut-shaped building just outside Cheltenham, but it has always had a presence in London, and before Nova South, it was here, Palmer Street, St James's, and it's opposite the St James's Tube Station. You can see the sign there, that's the Adam and Eve pub on the corner. And I think that this looks much more like British spy novel territory than the glossy pink glass of Nova South. I can definitely imagine George Smiley coming out of this one. I think he'd be less happy in the tower that we've just seen. But as I say, all of these buildings are close together, and aside from this one, my heroine visits them all. She also interviews suspects in some other rather eminent buildings in Pimlico, one of which is Tate Britain. And she does this standing in front of Francis Bacon's 3 Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion, a triptych based on the Eumenides or Furies from Aeschylus's Oresteia. And that relates to the second book in the trilogy, the Cassandra Fortune trilogy, Oracle, which is set in at the Temple of Apollo in Greece. Now, needless to say, the suspect doesn't give much away, and Cassie hopes she'll get more out of the others. But in trying to do so, she gathers herself an ally, someone called Sir Rory Newcomen, who is in my book the former chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, and she meets him in the basement of the Linley Library at the RHS halls in Vincent Square. There's a sort of ongoing joke in the book that Sir Rory, who has now retired from the intelligence services, of course, manages to get a key to just about everything. And one of the places he gets the key to is this research library, which is in the basement of the Royal Horticultural Halls. The Intelligence and Security Committee is a parliamentary body. And I say this because people often confuse it with the Joint Intelligence Committee, which is not a parliamentary body. That has no statutory remit. But the ISC is there to examine all aspects of the security and intelligence services, all the 3 that I've mentioned, as well as the Ministry of Defence, Defence Intelligence, and others. It is different to the Joint Intelligence Committee, which gained notoriety after the so-called dodgy dossier under the Blair administration, when its chairman was Sir John Scarlett. That is an interagency body. It has no statutory basis, though it is chaired by a permanent chair. Now, another place that Sir Rory has the key to is this, Duck Island Cottage. I don't know whether any of you have actually been inside the cottage. I long before COVID, I went to this part of it, but I've never gone over the bridge and looked into the other half of it. And I'm pretty sure I don't need to tell you its history because you're the Thorney Island Society members. But in fact, Sir Rory recounts it to Cassie, and he says, the cottage became a sort of sinecure for whoever was the monarch's favourite. Now it belongs to the Historic Parks and Gardens Trust, but there's been a dwelling here since the 17th century, when St James's was a real hunting park and Birdcage Walk was lined with the aviaries of game birds. Then it fell within the perquisites of the Ranger of the Parks. Horace Walpole called Lady Pomfret the Queen of Duck Island when her husband got the post. I don't think she was pleased. I bet she wasn't. But it is, I mean, not this particular building, but a dwelling has been here for a long, long time. It has quite a long history. And there's the larger part of Duck Island, the Duck Island Cottage on the island itself from a different angle. But St James's Park is very much the traditional haunt of spies. You know, how a gentleman walks along the lakeside and sits on a bench to feed the ducks, only to be joined by another man carrying a newspaper, and the second man leaves, but the newspaper stays behind, and whatever it contains is there to be picked up by the first man. Very much a cliche in book and film. And I didn't want to do that in opera because it's been done so often, but I did want to use St James's Park as a place of reflection for the heroine, even though the book is set in December and much of the park is closed up, all the kiosks and so on, and it's quite windswept and empty. Because when I was a civil servant, one of the real perks was being able, if I was able to get away, was to go and walk around St James's Park and just take a few minutes out from the working day. It was, of course, very near to Whitehall, where I used to work. And where my heroine works, she has a desk in the Cabinet Office. This sign for Whitehall is, I'm sure you'll recognise, on the corner of the banqueting house at the corner of Whitehall with Horse Guards Avenue. Whitehall features in the novel, as does a cafe there, which is no longer there, I think, but I can remember going to in my time. And I think it used to be called Ponty's, but I call it Carlo's in the novel, and people meet up while they're waiting in the queues for sandwiches and so on. I can remember that happening quite a few times. You'd go out to get yourself some lunch and then have to dive out of the way because you saw someone important standing in the queue in front of you, and you didn't want to get collared and asked questions about what you were doing there. The other thing that's, well, here we are at the bottom now of Whitehall. Whitehall leaves Parliament Square, and only a stone's throw away is Bridge Street. And on the corner of Bridge Street and the bridge, we have the equestrian statue of Boudicca, or Boadicea, as she would have been called by Thomas Thornycroft, who was the sculptor who made the sculpture. The interesting thing about this is that is the omission of any reins. Boudicca appears to be steering her chariot by force of will alone, because there's no other way of directing that pair of horses. Although she has got two of her daughters with her, there's one on this side, there's one on the other, who could presumably be acting as a charioteer, but they don't. There is no set of reins there. It is actually now a listed building, I understand, and the base of the statue is usually obscured by a sort of souvenir kiosk or stall. But traditionally, there is a door in its base. And when I was researching for Plague, which if people have read it will know that a lot of it is set in the sewers beneath London, this was, in some of the sources I found, mentioned as a way into those sewers, the door in the base of of the statue of Boudica. Quite a lot of readers have told me that they would like to search for that door and they've never come across it. But that's largely because it's blocked off pretty much all the time by a tourist kiosk. But this does feature again, whether fictitious or real, especially in the denouement of opera, which takes place in the Palace of Westminster. In fact, it takes place beneath the Palace of Westminster. Although Plague took place underneath much of London, certainly the lost course of the River Tyburn and that warren of World War I bunkers that exists underneath Whitehall, some of which can be visited as the Churchill War Rooms off King Charles Street. In opera, we actually go into the palace itself. Now, this is an old photograph, but I wanted to use it because I think it shows specifically parts of that are pertinent in a way that some of the more modern ones don't. So you've got here, just slightly obscured, there's the tower above Central Lobby, that's the Central Tower. And then you go along the corridor here to the Commons Lobby, and this is the roof here of the Commons Chamber. We also have Speaker's Garden here, or sometimes called Speaker's Green, which is quite clearly shown. And here we have that statue and plinth of Boudica on the corner of the embankment and the bridge. This is a rather old plan of the palace, and I'm sure that none of this will be new to you. I'm sure you all know what the inside of the palace looks like. And here you have Central Lobby, there's the corridor to the Commons Lobby, and then you go into the debating chamber itself here, which I've got a slide of, and you can see the Speaker's chair there and these doors behind it, and that's quite relevant, because if I blow up that particular part of the map, you will see here that you have the division lobbies on either side of the debating chamber. I don't know if any of you have, I'm pretty sure you will have taken a tour of the Palace of Westminster. And if you go on days when the House is in recess or the Commons isn't occupied for some reason, I don't know whether they actually take you through the division lobbies in the early morning tours, but they certainly do when the House is in recess. You can actually go through these lobbies and see where the MPs would walk in order to cast their votes. The House divides for a vote when the division bell sounds, and MPs then have 8 minutes to get into the division lobbies and vote aye or nay, the ayes to the right, the noes to the left, as you hear the Speaker say often, though it doesn't have to be that way then. And after 8 minutes, the doors here are closed. So if the MPs have not got into the voting lobbies in 8 minutes, they don't get to cast their vote. Now, I never quite understood, because anyone who looks at estate agents' advertising copy will recognise a description of the division bell area, that area around the Palace of Westminster, where you can, in theory, hear the division bell, though these days I'm not sure that you'd be able to over the roar of the traffic. But they certainly seem, some of those places certainly seem further away than 8 minutes, although there are lots of places outside of the Houses of Parliament which have electronic or mechanical division bells, which sound when the division bell in the House of Commons sounds. And here is a picture of the East voting lobby. The MPs come in through here, pass through and return. They pass through past the tellers where they cast their vote, and they return to the chamber through that door behind the Speaker's chamber that I pointed out earlier. In the book, Cassandra is accompanied by a character called Frank Cairns, who appeared in Plague too, who was a recently ennobled former MP, who knows his way through the voting lobbies and leads her through these rooms when they chase after the escaping villain, who has gone out of the voting system and down the stairs at the back of this whole complex to the basement. And here we have pictures of said basement. These were taken before the recent refurbishment, and they do illustrate somewhat why refurbishment was needed. I mean, this part of Thorney Island, as you know, is very low-lying and had not been embanked in the same way as the rest of it. There are over 250 miles of cabling, or there were 250 miles of cabling down there, and much more in the towers and roof spaces. It's largely because every time they put in a new system, they simply put in a new system. They didn't take the old one out. It was far too difficult to get rid of them. I hope now that they've rationalised it all, and it doesn't look like this. But it's through these corridors of piping and electricity cables that my heroine runs with fat cans in pursuit of the villain. And they run to a room which no longer exists, though it had used to, and it used to be called the torpedo room, which housed the Victorian machinery used for raising the waste products of the palace up to the level of the new sewer, which runs close by, but not beneath the palace. This is largely because Basil Gett, who is a huge hero of mine, as me looking at him, looking at his memorial on the Victoria embankment, built the sewers after the palace, which had been reconstructed after the fire of 1834. So what the palace used was a combination of the previous sewers and cesspits, allowing a fairly enormous build-up of effluent beneath the palace. And before 1858, this was simply flushed into the river. In fact, the MPs, especially after the Great Stink, decided that they needed to do something about it, and they contacted a gentleman called Isaac Shon. Now, Isaac Shon was born in Wrexham in North Wales, where he was an apprentice mining engineer for the Brimbo Coal and Iron Company. His grandfather was mining agent for the Marquis of Westminster, and when that gentleman died, the mining engineer, Shon succeeded him. And 3 years later, he moved to London to start an engineering practice in Westminster with his partner, Mr. Edwin Alt, and Shon and Alt were a very famous engineering partnership. And he invented the Shon system of drainage, which by means of hydropneumatic ejection, combined with compressed air, rendered low-lying districts, and this is a little quote from him, as healthy as those where the sewage can be conveyed by gravitation. And the system was adopted for the Houses of Parliament, also for the Royal Courts of Justice, for Hampton Court Palace, in Eastbourne, and in quite a lot of other places in the world. So Rangoon, for example, has quite a lot of Shon machinery in its cellars of its institutions. He went on to devise apparatus which effectively ventilated and flushed house drains and sewers, and was constantly proposing improvements to drainage and sewerage systems. He died at home in Putney in June 1918 at the age of 82, having travelled all around the world installing his inventions. And this is a cross-section of his pneumatic ejector station beneath, beneath the Speaker's garden. I pointed out where the Speaker's garden was in the photograph, and I'm sure you appreciate that. And you've got Westminster Bridge here in the background, and the approach to it. And the room in which the equipment was held was lit by these two enormous light wells that go up to the garden. And here you've got his, what he called his tumbling spheres, that in which the various waste products were circulated. Excuse me, I'm going to have a drink of water. And then enlarging this element here, the Using compressed air, the sewage was then ejected into these pipes here, which was then flowed out into the metropolitan sewer. Oh dear. Heaven knows why I suddenly got a croak. Now, this is the place where the denouement of my novel takes place, in the so-called torpedo room. It was so called because the every so often you'd have this huge explosion of compressed air as the air forced the sewage out of the tumbling spheres and out of the pipes into the main sewer. In opera, the weaponless Cassandra comes face to face with the villain in the torpedo room. But he, of course, is rather reluctant to fire his firearm for fear of fracturing a sphere or a pipe and scalding them both to death. So it's a good place for a denouement. And my heroine actually says, she realized that the room itself was part of a huge and complex mechanism, a hydro-pneumatic engine, the brick walls holding pipes linking back with the palace, or in the case of one massive overhead tube going into the sewer at an upper level. There was a constant whistling and gurgling noise. She was standing inside a machine full of compressed air and steam. Now, of course, he can't use his pistol, so that evens up the odds somewhat. Nonetheless, I won't say any more about what happens, because it will spoil it for people who might want to read the book. Sean wrote quite prolifically about his engines, and I came across this tome, The Main Drainage of the Houses of Parliament at Westminster, by the Sean Hydro-Pneumatic System, which was published by E&FN Spon Limited of London in 1887. I actually came across it in a Californian university library, though it was subsequently uploaded to the Open Library. And I confess that I have not read very much of the detail of this. And whilst I understand the broad principle of the engineering that was in his invention, I certainly don't understand the detail. But what I do love is this quote here, which is part of Sean's frontispiece to this particular book. And he says, "Invention that knocks hard and often before the doors of the mind open to receive it. And too frequently then the reception is but a surly one." And this, I think, could apply to fiction writing as equally as to writing about engineering. And so I have quoted that in my book, Opera, because I think it's very appropriate. And that's where my talk for this evening concludes. You said 40 minutes, Jules? I think I've got 40 minutes for you there. So, I mean, has anyone got any questions?
I've got quite a few things that I've written down. That was absolutely brilliant, Julie. It's clear that you just love the history, and it's so fun the way you incorporate it. Okay, so one thing quick question I got about the torpedo room. You said it wasn't there anymore. So do they pump their effluent some other way these days?
Yes, much more modern. Although those tumbling spheres were actually there until relatively recently. A lot of the basement in that part of beneath Westminster was lost when well, two things happened. First of all, they put a car park in, and secondly, you had the new lower level underground line when they refurbished Westminster Station. But the big metal spheres were still there until relatively recently.
They would be quite a collector's piece, I'm sure. They looked brilliant, yeah. And the Isaac Sean, what a find.
I know, he's wonderful, isn't he?
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, I love that, the picture. Yeah, and his quote is superb. Yeah.
And nobody's ever heard of him. I mean, people are now beginning to know about Bazalgette, and quite properly too, you know, great man in my view. But someone like Isaac John, nobody knows about him. At least I haven't met anyone. Tell me, has anyone heard of him? Have any of our listeners heard of him?
Hang on,
Well,
Victor,
I can't hear you.
Victor, unmute.
I guess then we have now. We have
Oh,
now.
we've heard of him now. Definitely.
Oh, well, you
Brilliant.
have now. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I have this sort of vision of this sort of Welshman coming from the mines of North Wales and turning up in Westminster and just deciding to wow them all with this amazing machine, which is rather lovely.
Yeah.
Are you halfway through your next book, and is it also featured in the area around here?
I submitted my manuscript yesterday, my latest manuscript.
Good timing.
And it is good timing. It's not book 4 in the series. I said I'd do 3, and indeed there is another that's sort of in my head, but I wanted to do something slightly different next time. And though it is, of course, involving all sorts of history, because I can't help that. And it's set in Clapham. In 1946, and involves a place which I don't know whether you've heard of, which was the South London Hospital for Women and Children. The buildings, some of the buildings of which are still there at the south, at Clapham South, where the Clapham South tube station is. I researched that because I discovered. Forgive me, I'm going to get very enthusiastic about my next one now, and I'm not going to take questions about the last one. But I discovered that particular hospital was a hospital that was run by and for women. So rather like the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson in North London. Indeed, the 2 women surgeons who set it up had trained at the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. And they raised the money. They were suffragists and feminists, and they raised the money in the early part of the 20th century and set up this hospital, which was staffed entirely by women. And I went into the archives and read lots of their management board meetings, and it's weird. There are no men. There are no male names at all. You know, even the porters, you know, were women, which was such an unusual thing. So I had to use that. And I wanted to write about the pandemic without writing about the pandemic. So somewhere, a period where the whole globe has undergone a huge sort of conflagration and it's just come to an end. It seemed to me, you know, that would be World War II, and just after World War II would be a good corollary for us having got through COVID, and thinking everything was terribly bleak and so on. So I will not now mention that anymore because I get very enthusiastic about it, and I'll happily take questions on the presentation. I can't help writing about history, I'm afraid. It's just
And your, attention to the buildings and the architects are really good. So it is rubbish that that James Bond was able to get a speedboat from inside the MI6 building. There isn't a water entrance, is there?
there is a moat, though. There is a moat.
Right.
But the moat doesn't go right the way around, does it?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
Okay.
I used to, as I said in the presentation, I used to work in Riverwalk House, which was opposite that building, and people used to love saying, "Can you remember the old what was it called? That semi-aquatic tour?"
Oh yeah, the boat, the
boat that used to drive down the ramp. Painted yellow, called the Duck or something.
Yeah,
and then sort of slowly turn into a boat and
that's
go
right,
off.
amphibious. I think one caught fire and they had to stop it.
Well, that was always a bit of a highlight for the people sat working at their desks and looking out the window and see the duck appear and go down the ramp into the Thames.
Can I ask about the services under the Houses of Parliament, which I understood were going to take years and years and years to fix, but you said that the basement had now been renovated in all those services. But
well, no, I said that I hoped that they were renovating them. I don't know whether they have.
They're working very slowly at it.
I suspect. I mean, there were huge debates, of course, about decanting out of Parliament in order to allow for the work, and they decided they didn't want to. So it'll all proceed
forever. Yeah,
absolutely. And it is difficult because if you go down there, or indeed if you go up into some of the towers, into the roof space, I mean, there are just so many cables because they never taken any out. You know, decades and decades of just of piling one system on top of another one. It just makes no sense, but
that's
what they decided. Has anyone actually, sorry.
But you seem to be writing a novel a year. Is that your strategy?
I don't, it's not actually a novel yet. It looks like it partly because I wrote Plague. I started writing Plague in 2018 and it wasn't published till 2020. So I had a sort of run at that and then was able to start the next one quite early. So it looks like I have an incredible output, but it's a little deceptive in that I did begin writing this trilogy in 2018, and it gets easier actually when you're on your third book because you've already established your characters by and large. I mean, there are new characters brought in, but one has a sort of central core of characters who've already been established, so one doesn't have to do that anymore, and that becomes rather easier to write than the first one when you have to establish all the characters, which is what of course I've been doing with my latest one. But I was going to ask whether anyone had actually heard of the Torpedo Room. No. And yet it was quite a thing. It was quite well known when I was there, when I was talking to people who worked there. Though of course it hasn't been functioning for many years.
May I ask you a question on a completely different tack, which is to what extent was your interest in your surroundings as a civil servant and, you know, being placed in offices around that area, personal to you, or do you think it's shared by your co-workers? I mean, how many people come into London every day in what is the most extraordinarily rich historic sort of area, and actually it passes them by, and I just sort of wonder what that balance really is.
Well, you and me both, I think. I mean, I found it, I couldn't understand why people didn't take more interest in the history that was all around them. But I guess, I mean, for me, it's relatively simple. I lived in Clapham. I did get the number 88 bus into work every day. And so that bus takes you past all the ministries up Marsham Street and then, up through into Victoria Street and Parliament Square and up Whitehall. And you can't avoid seeing this all around you. I suspect if you come in by train from the home counties, and you get out, you get to Fenchurch Street or Waterloo or something, and then you get the tube, and you come out of Westminster Station, and walk straight across the road to work. It's not as immediately apparent to you as if you spend time either coming in by bus or walking around. But I personally don't know how people don't take any notice of it, because it's very difficult to. I mean, it's all around you and fascinating, especially the hidden bits, the things that people don't know, the things beneath the ground or beneath the palace or, all that sort of thing. It's a shame. I mean, I think the civil service itself tries its best. I mean, the publicise tours of the Palace of Westminster on a regular basis. They used to have them done by some of the regular tour guides who would take, civil servants could sign up for it and get taken round. If you went into Cabinet Office and down into the basement there and saw some of the old Whitehall Palace works, those were, relatively popular. People would show their friends and visiting relatives them, as it were. But by and large, people didn't take too much of an interest. I'm sure there would have been some people, without doubt,
Did you go into the cockpit?
Oh, the pub.
No, there's a cockpit. One of the features under the government buildings. There's a
Yeah.
cockpit, but
Yeah.
I've never actually been there. But
No, I haven't.
I don't
I
know
haven't. No.
I don't know what it is, whether it's a reconstructed one or whether it's old or whatever. I don't know.
No, I don't know. I know of it, but largely in relation to. I mean, that's why the pub got its name, isn't it? You know, that because it was close by. But I've never been there. I have been down. Have you been around Somerset House? Because that has all sorts of wonderful things in its basement.
Oh
and
yeah,
below,
they got.
including.
Sorry.
No. I was going to say, including a graveyard, which is quite interesting.
Yes, and they got that fountain which was fed from the building next door, and there's also parts of the original Somerset House. The walls are still there at one end of it, but most of it is obviously relatively new.
It's all subterranean London is just so interesting, really.
Yes.
Hi, yes.
No, I'm sorry, I have to go back to the book that you are actually working on.
Yeah.
But which hospital is it? Is that Endor Street Hospital?
No, it's in Clapham. Yeah, it
somewhere
was
else.
called the South London Hospital for Women and Children.
Okay.
It's not there anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, the one of the buildings is still there, 1930s building, because it was a listed building. The hospital was closed in 1986 by Wandsworth Health Authority, and in fact it became a bit of a cause célèbre for the women's movement because it was one of the few women-only hospitals remaining.
Yes.
And the building was occupied by a lot of nurses who used to work there, as well as I think the Greenham Common women came and occupied it, and various other groups tried to keep it open. But ultimately, and I mean, there were debates in the House of Commons and things. It features in Hansard, for example. And today, I mean, I was last week I was talking with a lady, Juliet Boyd, who was a surgeon there in the 70s and 80s, who was kind enough to agree to read the manuscript of the book, even though it's set 30 years before she worked there, to sort of make sure I got some of the geography right and so on. And you talked to Juliet about the closure, which was supposedly on budgetary grounds. And even now, you see her blood pressure rise. She says it's got nothing to do with the budget. They wanted to close us down because we were women only.
Yes. That one in Endor Street was also staffed by suffragettes, apparently. And men only took the bins out, but apparently.
Yeah.
There were other ones as well. I didn't know.
Yes. It's and it kept going. It did keep going to 1986. But it must have been an interesting place. When I was researching, sorry, I'm talking about the next one now. When I was researching it, I did look at the management board minutes, as I said, and I looked at the management board minutes of other hospitals so that I'd got a point of comparison and could, compare between the two. And it was quite interesting. Immediately post World War II, just about everywhere in London, all the hospitals were saying that they had a nursing shortage. And these deliberations of the great and the good looking after these hospitals about how they could attract more nurses and should they pay them more and should they try and attract young men into, who out of the forces into nursing and so on. And it never arose in the minutes of the South London. Talking to Juliet, she was saying they never ever had any problem because nurses wanted to work there, because it was a women-only hospital, and most nurses were women. Women, and they had a midwifery school there as well. I think it sort of speaks volumes that they had no problem getting any of their nursing and initial clinical staff when everywhere else was bemoaning the lack of nurses. I wanted to sort of immortalize it a bit, really, because I couldn't find anything about it. Nobody seems to have written about it. I mean, I found snippets here and there online, and it's definitely mentioned in Hansard, as I said. But nobody seems to have written a biography of it, or you know, even acknowledged its existence in a sort of formal way. I mean, the two women who set it up, Maud Chadbourne and Eleanor Davis Colley, Eleanor was the first woman accepted into the Royal College of Surgeons, and Maud Chadbourne, who was older, was a Middlesbrough lady who came down to London to train, who was the daughter of a Methodist minister who apparently stood up in his pulpit and denounced her, saying that he would rather his daughter were dead than she became a doctor. So I think they both of them had to deal with quite a lot of prejudice. And they're just the first two of a whole series of remarkable women who kept this hospital going. So even in my small, you know, crime fiction way, I hope that I've kept the hospital alive, and people will read about it and learn about it and so on.
Oh, thank you. It's really nice when reading. I've read Plague. I took it on summer holiday yesterday. I'm afraid the binding didn't survive the Greek holiday of, like, you know, bending it back on the sun lounger. It's sort of falling apart a bit, but I'm on Oracle now. And what's just so nice is maybe a little bit of artistic license. I remember in the last talk you said you couldn't actually say where the security room was in the Palace of Westminster. So a few things, but apart, you know, otherwise it's just so nice. It's not all made up. You've researched things really well, and so we get a bit more out of it, you know.
Well, it was interesting because I had great difficulty doing the research on Oracle, because, as I say, it's set in Delphi, around the Temple of Apollo in Greece. And this was during COVID. This was COVID year 2020. And I had been there. Indeed, I'd been to a conference at the conference centre there, which features in the book. And I had memories of it, so I could write it. But I was very, very fortunate in that the lady who runs the performances and exhibitions at the conference centre, I got in touch with her, and she turned out to be a lady who liked reading detective fiction. So I sent her my manuscript, which she read, and then came back to me and said, you know, you have to, this has changed now. You have to. My Delphi, the Delphi I remembered, was a much smaller town than the modern Delphi is. And she was sort of saying, no, you don't have, you know, you can't walk out in the country between this point and that point, because it's all built up now. And things like that, which I had I been able to go there, and it would have been a very good excuse to go there. I would have seen for myself, but Mairo was able to tell me, and that was lovely. So I sent her a copy of the book when it was done, with a dedication and an acknowledgement in the back. Because it would have looked like Delphi would have looked 20 years ago, rather than how it looks today without her input.
Yeah, I suppose you've got to keep a bit up to date, because people are critical, I suppose, aren't they?
You'd be surprised the number of people who tell you, actually, no, that phone box, there isn't a phone box on that corner, you know. No, so it's tempting to just say, well, you know, I just made it up. But I do like to have it linked to a real place.
And the crime fiction that you write, it's good fun, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's not serious.
Not too serious.
That's right. A
little uncomfortable sometimes, but that's, you know, can't avoid that.
No. I mean, I hope the next one. I mean, the next one is crime fiction as well, but it's a little bit more about, you know, what it was like at the end of the war, and how people.
Can you please try and think of some connection to our area that we can have you to talk about the hospital?
Well, I'm happy to come back, but I'm not sure it's really Thorney Island
Maybe you could
territory.
maybe there could be some trip to, it's set in the 30s, so did you say? So the
It's
The
1946.
88 bus, the 88 buses.
88 bus, yeah. Or we could
Yeah.
we could help you with research, with a sort of thing going on with Westminster Hospital, underground passages under Rochester Row. No, not Rochester Row. Where is it? Horseferry Road. We got told about. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yes, yes. Well, they ostensibly go as far as Horseferry Road. Those passages. I've never been down that far, but apparently they're supposed to. But no, I don't think there'll be too much of a link. Although, I mean, in fact, the what is interesting in parliamentary terms is that during World War One, when the hospital was up and running, because of their founding documents, I mean, they could only take male patients up to the age of 7 because it was a women and children's hospital, and there had to be a special act of parliament actually read into statute in order to allow them to take casualties, male wartime casualties, and indeed it was a point of pride for the founders that whilst they wanted to help and they wanted to give medical services to casualties of war, it was a point of pride for them that had to be a resolution of the Houses of Parliament in order to make that possible, given that their constituent, their sort of the documents that created them and the formation that they had when it was set up. So I'm now completely, engrossed in all of that.
I'm sure. I've just been chatting with Graham. Graham lives quite near Palmer Street.
Oh yes.
And I just wondered, I'm asking him if he's if there are any local stories that he might know about Palmer Street. I'm going to put him on the spot and unmute him. Hi, Sam.
Any stories? I mean, it was a surprise to us when the current building has got planning approval for a demolition and replacement by a modern building, and I think that planning approval is about to expire. The first I heard of it from was from one of our local ward councillors, because I was trying to use the argument that that Palmer Street is protected by a series of bollards as an argument for protecting other very narrow pavements. And he told me on the confidentially, no, they're not there for pedestrians, it's to protect the building itself. And they will probably all be ripped out when the building is demolished, which will be a sad loss of a rather ordinary building, but as you say, part of the history of the area. And of course, there is so much in the Tothill Street and Broadway, part of Thorney Island, that reflects a previous generation before Curzon Street and the Waterloo Building. And even artillery mansions had a role in the early beginnings of the security service in the First World War, but all the buildings on Broadway and Queen Anne's Gate and the residence of the first Director General, it's an area that's what surprises me about the Nova building. There's no sign of security outside the a national cyber security center, but then there's no sign of security anywhere now. We don't see policemen regularly, but in the old days those places would have had guards.
Yes. Well, I mean, the old Waterloo building was built on top of a petrol station, which must have been, I mean, really. If you wanted to destroy it, if you were a foreign power, it would have been ridiculously easy.
Well, I mean, a small personal anecdote, when I first moved to this area in 1978, I was in Marsham Court on Marsham Street, and on the floor below me, in a slightly better flat, but not much bigger, I was in a studio. He had I think a 2-bedroom flat, was Maurice Oldfield, who was then in charge of MI6, and he walked to work, and at weekend, and he was chairman of the Residents Association, and it was, we would at weekends we'd walk to the Army and Navy food stores together, and stock up for the following week and things like that. And an extraordinary sort of place.
Mm. It is odd. I mean, when you think of all those offices so close together, I mean, you just need one enormous sort of bomb, and they'd all be taken out, wouldn't they? It's although saying that, I mean, because I experienced that scare in Vauxhall Cross when there was the bomb that was supposedly found in the tube station, and I was actually outside. With hundreds of other people running across Vauxhall Bridge as fast as we possibly could, which was a horrible experience, actually. But you could see the people who worked in Vauxhall Cross building actually going into the building and very, very secure that they would feel safe once they got inside. And I suspect that has been built with all sorts of security in mind.
But probably the weak points of all these buildings, and it was demonstrated in 2016 and in 2021, and this could link into into opera, is the sewage system. It is still the Bazalgette system, and it is under great stress, and it won't be fully relieved even with the new super sewer. And so many buildings in this area have been taken out by fatbergs and problems with the infrastructure down in the sewers. You could probably take out the House of Parliament by just one strategically placed intervention in the sewage system.
I think they may have thought of that, though.
Well, but could they do anything about it?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know, because I've not been along the sewers there.
Yes. Well, all the sewers in the Tothill Street area, for example, have been walked recently, and there are all sorts of problems with the crumbling infrastructure. So that's two major departments: work and pensions, justice, the parliamentary buildings, and the parliamentary building on Tothill Street regularly has its basement flooded with yuck.
Well, I mean, that was one of the sort of elements of the plot of Plague, in that they had to try and find out where this was going to happen, and so much of the sewers is underneath government buildings, which are supposedly secure. But no, I mean, when I was writing Plague, I tried to go down into the sewer and applied to Thames Water. And they wouldn't let me. I even, on the back of the Museum of London exhibition on secret rivers, with Tom Ardhill, Dr. Tom Ardhill, who was the curator of that exhibition, I tried to go down with them, and they wouldn't let them go down either. So I'm very interested to hear that people have been walking the sewers again.
Thames Water. Thames Water people.
There are these guerrilla groups that go through the sewers, and they produce.
I know about.
They go along. So they nearly all. Could I ask Graham a very quick question? When Maurice Oldfield was chair of your Residents Association, did people know who he was, or did you think he's a?
Oh yes, it was. I mean, it wouldn't have been in the minute. He'd actually retired, but he came back he just retired, took on the chairmanship, and then he got the position for Northern Ireland security supremo under Thatcher, and then he got ill and retired from that, and then sadly died at quite a young age.
So
but it was known within the building, and he didn't have a police guard on his flat until he got that Northern Ireland position.
Anyone who has a Northern Ireland position has a guard.
And we
And
had,
as indeed in opera, one of
Yeah.
my MP, Frank Kearns, takes up a junior ministry in Northern Ireland office and
Yes.
immediately gets a protection officer.
yeah. The funny thing at Marsham Court, there wasn't space on the sort of landings to get a full-time policeman, so you had to sort of walk by, you know, just squeeze by to get to the staircase, and there was a shift of people. But because that building had a division bell in the basement that is very popular and still is with politicians.
Yeah. And I can definitely understand Marsham Street. That's doable, isn't it? You can get from Marsham Street to the Houses of Parliament.
Yeah.
But I mean, sometimes you read these estate agents' blurbs, and they're on the other side of the river. You know, they're in Vauxhall or something, and they say, "Oh, it's Division Bell area," and you just think, "No, you wouldn't get there in 8 minutes. No way." But he would have worked in Thames House then when he was at the Northern Ireland office. Yeah. Interesting.
Did he have a bowler hat and briefcase, an umbrella?
He did actually. He was a shortish man, and he was friends with John le Carré, and le Carré took him out to lunch when they were filming Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and I mean this is well documented by le Carré and Oldfield's biographer, and introduced him to Alec Guinness, who played Smiley in the 1979
wonderful
television
series.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, have you? It's interesting that you had in sort of espionage fiction, you have James Bond and Ian Fleming, and then along comes le Carré, who completely undercuts all of that, and you have these sort of grey bureaucratic people working out of offices like Palmer Street, you know, that no one knows existed, like civil service buildings. And of course, in modern times, I don't know whether you like espionage novels, but you have someone like Mick Herron who comes along and undercuts all that again with Slow Horses and Slough House and whatever. Every 30 years or so, that gets revitalized by the new idea of espionage fiction.
Yeah,
I'm sure we'll have another one at some point.
Yeah. Well, you keep going. You'll right. Has anybody got any more questions? It's been so nice, Julie. Really, really great evening.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm very aware that, I mean, you guys know as much, if not more, than I do about Thorney Island and all that. I mean, you know, because you're the Thorney Islands, and so
I know, but I think you did us with Isaac Sean.
Oh, Isaac Sean! I'm proud of finding Isaac Sean.
Yeah, that was a very good find, and I'm
quite proud of Isaac Sean.
Yeah, is that picture you used, the diagram? Is that in that book?
Yeah,
and the copyright would have run out on that.
The copyright has run out, and you'll find it online. If you search Isaac Sean, you know, hydro pneumatic engine or whatever, you'll find him. You'll find him online. But he doesn't have a Wikipedia entry. So if someone might like to give you a Wikipedia entry, I'd like to do it actually.
Yeah, you should.
Just so that you know he's there and people see him and know who he is. I mean, you know, there's probably a square in Rangoon called the Isaac Sean Square or something, but we don't recognise him at all. Anyway.
Yeah, really good finds. All right. Well, thank you, Julie, very, very much.
My pleasure.
And thank you, everybody, for joining. And we'll see you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.